I find this place quite a melancholic sight. It's Cefn Gorlau, the Ridge of Light, this open windswept moorland between Tredegar and Rumney. And I think the name of this place is quite ironic given the subject of today's film. If you want social history writ large on the landscape, well, this is the place to visit. It's so important because here we get an opportunity to gain a little understanding of what life and death was like for the thousands of people who flooded into South Wales in the 19th century. You know, much has been written about the history of the valleys of South Wales in the 19th century, and these publications give us a much better understanding of what life must have been like for those people who came into these places and were in the forefront of the industrialization of Wales and indeed the rest of the world. But it's at here, this really well-preserved gravestone, that we get an insight into the harshness of life. This is the memorial to Thomas James, who was a roll turner at Tredegar Ironworks, and the poem gives a clue about what happened to him. One night and day I bore great pain, to try for cure was all in vain, but God knew what to me was best, did ease my pain and give me rest. The date of his death is important. He died on August the 18th, 1849. And August, in theory, is one of the hottest months of the year. And it was the summer months that often caused problems for people, because it was then that there were the greatest demands on and often the shortest supplies of water available. And why was water in such short supply? Well, the answer is both simple and complicated. First and foremost, water was there to provide for the industries. Obviously to power water wheels, to feed boilers, to top up canals and everything else. And then secondly, way down the pecking order were the needs and the demands of the people who were there to serve those industries. The year 1849 was important because it was one of 4 years in the 19th century, 4 particular years that etched themselves in the collective memories. The other years were 1832, 1854 and 1869. And those were the times when cholera swept across Wales. Cholera, as it was also known as the Great Miasma and God's awful fear. There are between 150 and 200 people buried here in this cholera graveyard, and this site was chosen because of its location. At the time, they thought that cholera was borne on the air, and so any contagion here would have been swept away by the prevailing westerly winds. You know, such was the virulence and violence of this disease that it could indeed see you off in the space of 24 or 48 hours, especially if you were not particularly healthy and well fed. If you were well fed and watered, if you did live in good conditions, and if you weren't exposed to constant hard manual labor, then your chances of survival were much, much better. However, if you lived here in Merthyr Tydfil in the mid-19th century, well, depending on where you lived, if you were in one of the cellars or back-to-back housing or the squares, then your life could be under threat because no running water, no sewage disposal, rubbish dumped in the streets, chronic overcrowding. They were the perfect conditions for disease and degradation. Although in contrast, many of the contemporary reports spoke about the cleanliness of the interiors of the houses, no doubt like these behind me, because here, of course, the individual or the families could control their environment, but out in the streets, anything went. It really was filth and decay. A doctor described a typical scene in 1853. This is what he wrote. It's quite a long quote. "I can hardly expect credence for such facts as the following, yet it's perfectly free from exaggeration. I saw a young woman filling her pitcher from a little stream of water gushing from a cinder heap, the surface of which was so thickly studded with alvine deposits that it was difficult to pass without treading on them, in some of which I saw intestinal worms, and the rain then falling was washing the feculent matter into the water which the girl was filling into her pitcher, no doubt for domestic use." Little wonder then that in 1851 it was estimated that the average life expectancy in this town was just 17.5 years of age. Well, evidence for such claims can be found in abundance here in the cemetery on the way up to Pontycyll, because even as late as the end of the 19th century, infant mortality was one of the heartbreaks. And many of these gravestones here are like mini essays in human tragedy. But thankfully changes did take place from the mid-19th century onwards, particularly through the work of reformers and doctors in the town. There were a real wonderful group of doctors here. One especially was so well revered. He was Dr. T.J. Dyke, who served the town for getting on for 60 years. The main game changers, of course, the provision of fresh, clean water supplies and the adequate disposal of sewage and waste. And these reservoirs really are a tribute to the work of reformers, engineers, and hundreds of others who worked so closely together to build these incredible life support systems. I know when the water bill comes through the letterbox, you always think, oh, crumbs, another bill. But I think about the consequences of not having fresh water on tap. And within a space of a few hours, we would then be searching for the nearest unpolluted stream, or, as in the case of Merthyr Tydfil in the middle of the 19th century, you would stand for perhaps 10, 12 or 14 hours, or even overnight in a queue, waiting your turn to fill your pitcher of water from the spout or spring. So, next time we turn on a tap and that wonderful precious liquid gold flows so easily and cleanly through our fingers, well, let's spare a little thought for Thomas James of Tredegar and thousands of others like him.